Welcome in the latest episode of Rivals Down South. I'm SEC Mike, joined by Chris Marler, Saturday Down South, one of my favorites. I always love talking to Chris after an Alabama loss, so this is going to be a great show. How you doing, buddy?
This is the first time we've spoken since the game on Monday. I'm shocked that I didn't get a text from you 3 minutes after the game ended.
I was trying to give you space so we could do this properly, Chris. So great to see you as always. But, man, big news in the SEC. The season for the SEC over. Not for college football. Obviously, we'll get into the national championship on the tail end here. But the news never really stops, does it, Chris, in the SEC? And we had a bombshell this week with Quinshon Judkins, outstanding running back for Ole Miss. I think he's the best running back in the country, hitting the transfer portal. And I was concerned this could happen, given that all these pieces that Ole Miss was adding via the transfer portal. I mean, you got your best player here not committing to coming back next season, leading up to the bowl game. Everybody likes to omit that Jackson Dart was in the same boat. I'm sure he got the deal he wanted. But when you're adding Walter Nolen and Juice Wells and Princely and Tyler Barron, on and on and on, you got to take care of your homegrown guys. And I don't know if, that's the sole reason that Judkins left Ole Miss. But what was your initial reaction with arguably the best player at his position in the SEC, if not the country, hit the portal?
Yeah, honestly, it was surprising because the name itself, which I don't think we heard any rumblings that he was planning on leaving or unhappy or anything like that. And also going into his draft eligible year and the success he's already had, it's like he's going to thrive in this offense like he always has in the first 2 years he's played there. Was surprised, but then you start thinking about it, purely speculation. I just find myself coming back to the same thing over and over, which is if you're the main guy on this team, right? He has been the star of this team last year when they weren't as good, and he's been the main name and face, I feel like, of the program, besides maybe Dart, all year this year where they had all the success. If you're that guy for this program, and then you're seeing Walter Nolen, former number one overall player in the country, probably getting a huge bag from the NIL, I mean, I think that I don't say in a greedy way, but you deserve to be paid and think you should deserve to get paid. I also wonder if we're going to start seeing stuff like this that we've seen in the NFL, where the valuation for running backs is kind of similar to what we see in the NFL, which is, hey, not a lot of like a shelf life with them or for a career wise. So we're not going to pay them as much money, because the rumors I heard was he was asking for, like, most running backs are getting $500,000 with their premier and elite. He was asking for 2 to 3 times that.
Right. And to your point, I mean, you see it from Lane Kiffin. Now it's always dangerous to read too much into his tweets, but he's tweeting from a boat, catch and release. You're seeing Jackson Dart, star quarterback, of course. He's subtweeting Judkins with Tom Brady. Selfishness, players have no space here. I'd rather face you than have you on my team. And I don't know, Chris. I mean, I think this is a player that, aside from Herschel Walker, he's the only player in his first 2 years in the SEC who's had 15 rushing touchdowns each of his first 2 seasons in the league. There's only 4 running backs in the conference that rushed for 1,000 yards this year. There's only 4 that ran for 1,000 last year. Judkins he did it twice. He did it both years. So we're talking a premier player, and all indications are he may be headed to Auburn. So Jackson Dart may get his wish. He's going to be facing Judkins likely if that happens. So I don't know. What do you take from one of the best players in the country leaving? And it seems like Ole Miss not very upset to be losing him.
Yeah, it has a little bit of the Evan Stewart vibe to it, where you're talking about how, I didn't think that was something that we'd ever talk about, right? Like, we haven't heard any rumblings about any of that and how anyone's unhappy. But yeah, I mean, look, the subtweeting and the pettiness of that is clearly the best part of this entire story, and also of the offseason, because Lane Kiffin is perfect for this. He's going to absolutely thrive in it. But Jackson Dart is the fact that we're breaking news with, did you see Jackson Dart's Instagram story today? Is incredible. But I think from what I could gather from it, this is again speculation because I don't follow him. I just post Taylor Swift lyrics to all my Instagram stories. But it seems like, yeah, they're clearly not that upset. And I don't think it's because you can just go get another serviceable back. It's probably because, there might have been some ego issues in that locker room already, which, him going to Auburn, I don't think would be a huge shock. But going to the team that didn't recruit you out of high school when you're in their backyard to prove a point to the team that did seems also kind of weird.
Yeah, and this is all in the shadow of Ole Miss looking like not only an SEC contender, but a playoff contender with the format, of course, going to 12-team format next year in the college football playoff. I think most people assume Ole Miss is going to be a lock for this thing. So maybe, as strange as it sounds, you get better with a player that's not fully bought in. You're adding all these pieces. Ole Miss really, the separation between them, Alabama and Georgia, is in the line of scrimmage. They've attacked that via the portal. I hear they're not done via the portal, adding specifically an offensive lineman from LSU. So that'll be interesting to see. But I wanted to ask you, Chris, looking ahead to next season, who is that next team? You know, we got Washington here in the upcoming national championship. Who in the world could have seen that coming a year ago? But I think there's a couple candidates out of the SEC that could get there, and Ole Miss is certainly one of them for the next year playoff, and maybe not just making the playoff, but making a run. Anyone else other than Ole Miss standing out to you?
Yeah, I hate to say this because I don't know if I've ever complimented this team in front of you. I'm sure I've done it to other people that deserve it, but the one I keep looking at, man, it's not just because of the way he played in the bowl game. It's Tennessee with Nico going into next year. I am very, very high on Tennessee, as much as it pains me to say. I just think that when you look what they have returning, it sets up so well, not just from the talent standpoint on the roster at the skill positions, but you talk about like that defense has been underrated at Tennessee for the last 2 years. We just don't talk about it because the offense gets all the headlines, right? But bringing in what is, maybe the most talented quarterback you've had in the last 25, 30 years. We'll see if he can be as efficient and explosive as Hendon Hooker was. But from a talent standpoint, he seems to get it. And when you got veteran leadership like Bru McCoy, and then all of these 5 stars and 4 stars coming in at the receiver position, I just feel like they're going to be very, very dangerous. And I think they get Bama at home next year. Hope Bama fans enjoyed that win in Tuscaloosa this year, because I'm not sure it's coming again next year. But Tennessee's one that jumps out to me that I think, as much as we give them a hard time on social media, the Vols might be back. I don't know if it'll feel like 98, but it'll be close.
Right, and one thing people overlook when it comes not only to Tennessee, but a lot of these teams, you look at Ole Miss, adding all these guys via the portal, but where there's a lot of inner workings that people are not seeing at a place like Tennessee, where they're keeping guys via the NIL. They're bringing back nearly the entire offensive line, and this is multiple 6-year players that they've kept via NIL. They're bringing back all but one starting defensive lineman. Again, a couple 6-year seniors in there, getting those guys to stay via the NIL. So while Kiffin and company, they may be portal kings, what have you, but I really think you're doing the portal the correct way if you're keeping your key pieces. Continuity is huge, making a run, surrounding Nico with all this talent like you alluded to. And another one that I've really got my eye on here, Chris, is the Missouri Tigers. I mean, they got red hot towards the tail. I mean, they whooped Tennessee. I hate to admit that, but they whooped Tennessee in Columbia, looked great in the bowl game, nearly blanked Ohio State. Do you think Missouri could be a team in a 12-team format that could make the playoff next year?
I mean, possibly. It's January 5th, so there's a lot of time left. I do want to go back to one thing you said. It's a really good point, especially because the segment is about who can be like next year's Washington. That is a very veteran team, especially the offensive line at Washington. That looks like Tennessee is that's the script they're running with in the blueprint. So I think that's even more to the point. Now Mizzou, I think that this team is one that gets slept on every single week. It's like we all have amnesia. We just refuse to accept them, not only in the conference, but like as an elite team. And they have been an elite team. That bowl game, you can talk about the opt-outs all you want. They held Ohio State to their fewest points in 7 years as a program. Really impressed with that. And the fact that Theo Weiss is staying, right? I hate to say it. Cody Schrader is great this year. I think you could find another Division II walk-on, maybe a diamond in the rough, and develop them. We'll see. Brady Cook, though, and Luther Burden and Theo Weiss coming back is huge. And I think now you get the ball rolling a little bit. Like you're going into next season is, the ship is still on your shoulder and a lot to prove. But that's it. Both of these teams, Ole Miss and Mizzou this year and Tennessee last year, would have easily gotten in if there was a 12-team playoff.
Right, and I love the fact that you mentioned Brady Cook, because I think it gets overlooked. Not only did he have a breakout season, but this was the first year in Kirby Moore's offense. So usually year two, like a Jaden Daniels, these are the years, like a Hendon Hooker recently, these are the years a guy really takes off in his second year in the system, surrounding Brady Cook with the talent. They got the running back from Georgia State, bringing back some offensive linemen. They stole away Oklahoma's best offensive lineman.
Yeah.
But one thing to keep out for Mizzou, keep an eye out on this. Blake Baker, defensive coordinator, recently agreed to a contract extension. Apparently, LSU has got their heart set on adding Blake Baker. His wife is an LSU grad. He's from Louisiana, went to Tulane. So this may be a case where he, would love to come back to Missouri, but if home calls, sometimes these coaches, it's just too much to overlook a program like LSU. So if they lose Blake Baker, it doesn't kill them, but I think it could hurt them looking ahead to a potential playoff run. But coming up next on Rivals Down South, we're going to talk some early Heisman odds. Chris and I, we're going to have a little debate here on Jalen Milroe. Is he even going to be the starting quarterback for the Alabama Crimson Tide after that horrific performance in the Rose Bowl? Get him out of here, I say, Chris. All right, welcome back into Rivals Down South. And man, do we got some hype for next year for Jalen Milroe. How about it, Chris? Early Heisman odds via FanDuel. Ewers and Milroe plus 750, best odds to win the Heisman Trophy. Are we even sure? I mean, better odds than Carson Beck, who's going to lead the #1 team in the country, who's red hot at the end of the season. Chris, is Milroe even going to be the starting quarterback? How in the world does he have the top odds here in the early FanDuel Heisman rankings?
I know. It's so crazy to think about the guy on this list who finished higher than everyone else on this list in this year's Heisman Trophy voting would even be considered for the award, honestly. He played that one game against Michigan at the #1 team in the country. He's terrible, clearly. We're not going to talk about the other 13 games, including the one where he beat Beck. I will say Beck, I think, has a better chance of winning. And also, just historically speaking, these numbers may come out, right? Vegas isn't saying that Jalen Milroe is a better quarterback than Carson Beck at all. The fact that, like, he is tied for the high or the best odds, I think you're trying to entice some early bets from people that are just like looking to take a flyer or whatever, have some fun. But since 2009, there's only one player that's won the Heisman who started out the year in the top 2 of the Heisman odds. So I don't think it's a huge deal either way. I will say Carson Beck on that list. When you look at the entire list that came out, it was almost like all entirely SEC teams for next year.
Right, and we're missing the best of all, Nico. To your point, maybe they couldn't spell his name, so they didn't put him on the graphic. But, I mean, Ty Simpson's coming back, Chris. I mean, you can't overlook that. There was a lot of speculation he would transfer out. The fact that he's coming, maybe he believes he could beat Jalen Milroe out. They just signed another 5-star. They had a freshman, Dylan Logarin, who was creating all kinds of camp buzz. Are you putting any stock into one of these quarterbacks unseating Jalen Milroe, or is that just asinine to say?
It's asinine to say, in my opinion. I think that when you look at maybe there's some directional state school, like I don't know, South Alabama, or they're going to go play on the road against for some reason, and one of them can start that game because it's just tradition at this point. But like going into next year, Ty Simpson, I know was a great, highly ranked recruit, all that kind of stuff. Milroe is the guy. And I think people want to talk about the Michigan game, and I fully get he did not look great in that Michigan game. But when you look at the entire body of work, this kid he exceeded everyone's expectations regardless. Like, he went 9-0 in the SEC. They won the SEC championship. His 2 losses were to college football playoff teams. And I tell you what, man, I just think when you talk about being behind an offensive line that gave up they got 49 sacks, which was 129th worst in the country. I mean, I'm not going to put a lot of blame on Jalen Milroe being the problem there.
Right. Well, if he wins the Heisman, I think it's because they replaced Tommy Rees. I truly think he is the real problem. But speaking of, being down, which I think Jalen Milroe will be next season, the SEC, were they embarrassed during the regular season? I thought in bowl season they acquitted themselves quite well up until that Rose Bowl, and that's the one everyone's going to circle anyway. But had Alabama won that game, I don't think we were having this conversation. But I don't know, Chris. I mean, I was driving the bandwagon for the decaying dynasty, and I think this is probably the worst Alabama team in the last 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, you could make that case for sure. I think that, in a lot of ways they overachieved. I think some people could say they overachieved or underachieved. But when you talk about the SEC as a whole, I get the narrative that the SEC is down, they're not as good. And it's funny because the people seeming to make that narrative are the same ones that were like, they're only good because Bama and Georgia, they carry the entire conference. It's kind of the same argument they're making about why the conference is down. It's like Bama and Georgia didn't win a national championship. That's why the whole conference is down. You had 4 teams in the conference win 11-plus games this year, which no other conference has ever done. The SEC has now done it 5 times in the last 14 years. But I thought they were, I wouldn't say top heavy, and the way they performed, regardless of the opt-out situation in bowl season, the wins they had against Penn State and Ohio State and some of these other teams, where it's not only from the Big Ten but ranked opponents, was really impressive. Okay. Yeah, I mean, so also when you talk about like just going into next season, I think when you look at the numbers from the bowl games, right, and this is specifically against Big Ten teams, but going into bowl season, the Big Ten, they had 4 teams in the top 5 in the country in total defense and yards per game allowed, right? Wisconsin was also, they also had the top 4 overall scoring defenses, giving up the fewest points allowed, 1 through 4. Wisconsin was also 17th, so you had 5 in the top 20. You look at bowl season. Wisconsin gave up the most points and most yards they'd allowed all season to an SEC team with LSU. Penn State gave up the most points and most yards they'd allowed all season to Ole Miss. Ohio State scored the fewest points they'd scored in 7 years against Missouri. And then last but not least, I'm missing one here. But the Iowa-Tennessee game. Of course, Iowa has no offense, but they gave up the most points they've given up to anybody all year. So I feel like saying it's a down year, you could make some arguments for it. I think that's also okay every once in a while. I'll just say the Pac-12, top to bottom, was the best conference in football this year. It doesn't mean the SEC isn't still a great conference. The other thing, too, is that some of these teams that aren't used to being in the top tier of the SEC, I think is probably the most refreshing part, because these aren't like blips. I feel like that it just kind of happen every once in a while. Ole Miss, you can make the case for, because it's their first 11-win season in program history. It's also a program that won 10 wins in 2 of their last 3 years. Also made a New Year's Six Bowl in 2 of the last 3 years as well. You talk about Missouri. A lot of people think this Missouri team was like a flash in the pan. The program's not that great. They obviously exceeded expectations. This is like the third time in the last 10 years that Missouri has been able to win 10 or 11 plus games. So I think there's a lot to be said for from top to bottom the SEC still being strong.
Yeah, sorry, I no-showed just like Alabama in the Rose Bowl here, Chris, but I do apologize for that. But yeah. But how about Georgia, Chris? I mean,
Yeah.
no, they got to be preseason number one, don't you think?
I saw that one pretty well-known publication had Bama at number one, which what are we doing at this point? Like, I don't get it. I guess Georgia, you can make the case for them. This is, to be honest, and I know you're asking a question I probably should just give you an answer to whether I know it or not. But in our business now, it is so odd to me because I don't know who's coming, who's going, who's going to still be on the roster after spring, what these recruits are going to look at, who's signing early, who's signing late. There's so much roster change and stuff that goes into, I think, who should be, ranked in the polls, all that kind of stuff. I know that Georgia is going to be one of the best teams in the country. I don't know where they should start. I think, Michigan, I don't know how many they're going to lose to the draft or if Harbaugh's going to come back next year, but that's also a really good team. Penn State is going to somehow weasel their way into like the top 6 to 7 teams in the country. But honestly, going into it, regardless of who's number one, it looks like that entire top 10 is going to be Big Ten and SEC teams. And I think that's going to be really interesting to see where that goes moving forward.
Right. Well, speaking of Harbaugh, we're going to preview the national championship game to close us out here. Our rivals down south, Washington, Michigan. No SEC to be found. I don't even know if I'm going to watch a game, Chris, but I'll predict it here on Rivals Down South. Welcome back in. Final segment, Rivals Down South. Chris, it is time to make our predictions for the national championship game. It's going to be the first championship game without an SEC team in 9 seasons. We got Michigan. They've not won a title since 97. I think that was only a half of one. I don't even know if we count that. Washington, last one in 91. I think that was a half or two. Who do you like in the big game here?
Yeah, ironically enough, those two were shared with Georgia Tech and Nebraska. respectively. So honestly, I think, listen, I know the SEC's not in it. It feels so weird and off that we're not talking about someone from the SEC playing for another chance at the trophy. But I will say these are two really, really good teams. I think you could say contrasting styles and all that kind of stuff, but also, listen, they're undefeated for a reason. Like I told you off air, I was blown away with how impressive Michigan was in all these areas I didn't expect them to be so great in. I do think it's going to be a battle. I don't think either team's going to necessarily blow anybody out. So you're not going to see like a TCU situation. I just have a hard time going away from Michigan. Just the fact that as much as I try to criticize them for not being able to throw in those last 5 games of the year, you start taking a look at it, man, they just, all they've done is win, and they are adaptable and can win in so many different ways. Washington kind of feels a little bit more like a one-trick pony.
Right, and I certainly think a high-scoring game, it goes without saying, favors Washington because their ease to go up and down the field. A low-scoring game certainly favors Michigan. But, at the end of the day, as good as Michael Penix was against Texas, everybody's all enamored with him. If he plays like that again, Washington will win the football game. But I just go back to Michigan dominating Alabama on a lot of critical fourth downs, short yardage situations. What's more realistic, Chris, that Michael Penix just carves up another elite defense, or that Michigan plays bully ball? It just seems like the percentages are with Michigan, and I hate to even say that because I'll be rooting for Washington. I don't want to see Jim Harbaugh win the game, but I lean pretty strongly to Michigan. Do you think that's fair?
Michigan's defense has given up over 20 points in a game 3 times this season. And so I don't see it being high scoring. They've also given up only 7 touchdowns to the air. Like they lead the country in so many categories like that. I have a very hard time thinking that Michael Penix is going to drop back and throw for 3 or 4 touchdowns against that defense at all.
Right, and if Michigan wins it, they're just going to douse him, not with Gatorade, but with milk, something awful like that. Jim Harbaugh's going to be off to the NFL. Yeah. I mean, it is going to be a scene, and they'll have their title vacated within 6 months probably anyway. So I
can claim it.
I think we all need to root for Washington for the good of the sport. As much as that, may offend a lot of these Michigan people up there. They know they were cheating the entire season. So this title, if it didn't go to the SEC, needs to be vacated in my mind anyway. But that's all I got. Again, I don't even know if I'll be watching the damn game if it don't have an SEC team. How relevant is it really? We'll give the Big Ten 1 out of every 10 years. But that's all we got on Rivals Down South. For Chris Marlar, I'm SEC Mike. Catch you on the next one.